Picture this. It's 30,000 years ago, somewhere in what we now call Siberia. The sun went down hours ago and the temperature is dropping fast. A small group of humans huddles around a fire. They're exhausted from the day's hunt, gnawing on bones, telling stories in a language we'd never understand. The firelight flickers against the darkness, creating a protective circle of warmth and light against the frozen world beyond. And just outside that circle, barely visible in the shadows, a pair of eyes reflects the firelight, watching, waiting, a wolf. Now you'd think this is where the humans grab their spears, where they shout and throw stones to drive the predator away. That's what should happen, right? Two apex predators competing for the same territory, the same prey. This should be a story about conflict, about dominance, about one species defeating another. But that's not what happened. Instead, something completely unprecedented occurred. Something that had never happened before in the history of life on Earth and has barely happened since. These two species, these two competitors who should have been enemies, somehow became partners. Not just partners, family. Today there are over 1 billion dogs living alongside humans. They're in our homes, sleeping on our beds, riding in our cars. We call them our best friends, and we mean it. Dogs herd our sheep, guide the blind, detect bombs, comfort the sick. And yes, they still just sit with us by the fire. We've shaped them into hundreds of different breeds, from Chihuahuas to Great Danes, yet they all share the same ancestor. That wolf in the shadows, watching our ancestors across the flames. But here's the question that keeps scientists up at night. How did this happen? How did humanity's greatest competitor become our closest companion? For years, the story we told ourselves was simple. Humans are clever. We saw wild wolves and thought, hey, those would be useful. So we caught some wolf puppies, tamed them, bred the friendly ones, and boom, we created dogs. We domesticated them. We were in control. It's a nice story. Clean. It puts humans firmly in charge of our own destiny. There's just one problem. It's probably wrong. See, the more scientists study the origin of dogs, the more they realize we've been telling the story backward. We didn't choose wolves. Wolves chose us. Or more accurately, certain wolves chose to live near humans, and in doing so, they began to change. They changed themselves, and in the process they changed us too. This isn't a story about domestication. It's a story about mutual evolution. About two species that shaped each other in ways neither could have survived without. The relationship between humans and dogs isn't something we created through willpower and selective breeding. It's something that emerged naturally from thousands of years of living together, evolving together, becoming something neither species could have been alone. Think about that. Every time you look into a dog's eyes and feel that connection, that sense of understanding, you're experiencing something that took 30,000 years or more to evolve. Dogs are the only animals that can read human facial expressions, that understand when we point at something, that can sense our emotions with uncanny accuracy. And we evolved too. Humans living with dogs developed different social structures, different hunting strategies, different ways of surviving in harsh environments. We didn't just create a useful tool, we created a new kind of relationship that had never existed before. A cross-species bond so deep that it literally changed our DNA and theirs. The evidence for this story is written in wolf fossils with shortened snouts, in ancient campsites where wolf and human bones lie side by side, in the genes of every dog alive today. It's written in archaeological sites across Europe and Asia, in the art our ancestors painted on cave walls, in the molecular clock ticking backward through thousands of generations. But putting it all together, understanding what actually happened during those crucial thousands of years when wolves were becoming dogs, that's one of the most fascinating detective stories in all of science. And here's what makes it even more incredible. This transformation might have saved us. During the last ice age, when resources were scarce and survival was uncertain, the alliance between humans and wolves may have been the difference between extinction and dominance. While Neanderthals disappeared and countless other species died out, we thrived. Not because we were stronger or smarter necessarily, but because we had partners. Because we weren't alone. The wolf in the shadows didn't stay in the shadows. It came closer to the fire, and when it did, both of our species were transformed forever. What happened next is a story spanning continents and millennia, involving cutting-edge genetics, ancient archaeology, and mysteries we're only beginning to solve. It's a story about how two predators became family, about how evolution doesn't always mean competition. Sometimes it means cooperation. Sometimes the shadow by the fire becomes the friend sleeping at your feet. But before we can understand how wolves became dogs, we need to go back even further. We need to understand what wolves were before they ever met us, before the first human ever looked into the eyes of a wolf and saw something more than a competitor or a threat, before everything changed. Go back 40,000 years. The world is locked in the grip of the last ice age. Not the Hollywood version with instant freezing and dramatic catastrophe, but the real thing. A slow, grinding transformation that has reshaped the entire planet. Glaciers 2 miles thick cover much of Europe, Asia, and North America. So much water is locked up in ice that sea levels have dropped 400 feet, exposing vast coastal plains that won't exist in the modern world. Britain is connected to mainland Europe. You can walk from Siberia to Alaska across a land bridge 1,000 miles wide. Indonesia is part of the Asian continent, and into this frozen world, two species are expanding their ranges with unprecedented success. Humans and wolves. Both recently emerged from evolutionary bottlenecks, both carrying genetic adaptations forged in crisis. Both developing sophisticated social systems that allow them to thrive in some of the harshest environments on Earth. Neither species knows it yet, but they're on a collision course that will change both of them forever. First, the wolves. Forget everything you think you know about wolves from nature documentaries. The animals we're talking about weren't quite like modern wolves. They were bigger, for one thing. Much bigger. The Pleistocene wolves that roamed Ice Age landscapes could weigh 150 pounds or more, some specimens pushing close to 200 pounds. That's nearly twice the size of many modern wolf populations. They had massive skulls, jaws powerful enough to crack mammoth bones, and teeth that could process everything from small rodents to megafauna. But more importantly, they were diverse. Incredibly diverse in ways that modern wolves aren't. Today, all wolves belong to a single species, Canis lupus, with relatively minor variations between populations. But 40,000 years ago, multiple wolf-like canids were spreading across the continents. Some were massive bone crushers, specialized for scavenging from the kills of saber-toothed cats and short-faced bears. Others were lighter, faster, built for pursuing prey across open grasslands. Some had evolved to hunt in deep forests, others in tundra, still others along coastlines and rivers. The archaeological record shows wolf remains from Alaska to Spain, from Siberia to the Middle East. Everywhere humans were expanding, wolves were already there, or arriving at almost the same time. This wasn't coincidence. Both species were following the same resources, the vast herds of herbivores that grazed the Ice Age steppes, mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, giant elk, horses, bison, reindeer, the megafauna that dominated Pleistocene ecosystems. What made wolves so successful in this world? The same thing that was making humans successful, social cooperation. Wolf packs aren't just random groups of animals travelling together. They're highly organized family units with complex hierarchies, sophisticated communication systems, and cultural knowledge that gets passed down through generations. Everything we thought we'd invented, wolves had been doing for hundreds of thousands of years. A wolf pack typically centers on a breeding pair, the parents, and their offspring from multiple years. The image of the alpha wolf constantly fighting to maintain dominance is largely a myth, at least in natural populations. What looks like dominance is usually just parental authority. The breeding pair leads because they're the most experienced, not because they're the most aggressive. Younger wolves follow because cooperation works. Fighting wastes energy and creates injuries that can be fatal in harsh environments. But within this cooperative framework, wolf packs achieve remarkable things. They hunt with a level of coordination that rivals human tactics. Wolves don't just chase prey until it gets tired, they strategize. Different pack members take on specialized roles during hunts. Some are scouts, ranging ahead to locate prey and assess herd composition. Others are flankers, positioning themselves to cut off escape routes. The fastest wolves do the pursuing, while more powerful individuals handle the actual takedown. Watch wolves hunt and you're watching something that looks uncannily like human cooperative hunting. There's planning, there's communication through body language, vocalizations, and probably signals we still don't fully understand. There's flexibility. When a plan isn't working, they adjust. Most impressively, there's teaching. Adult wolves actively instruct juveniles in hunting techniques, starting with small prey and gradually introducing them to more dangerous targets. This social learning creates what biologists call cultural transmission. Different wolf packs in different regions develop slightly different hunting strategies based on local prey and conditions. These techniques get refined over generations and passed down as pack traditions. Some packs specialize in hunting caribou, learning the migration patterns and developing tactics specific to that prey. Others focus on moose, a completely different challenge requiring different strategies. Coastal packs learn to hunt seals and scavenge whale carcasses. Mountain packs become expert at using terrain to trap prey. The sophistication of wolf communication is particularly striking. Wolves have at least 11 distinct vocalizations, each with subtle variations in meaning depending on context, pitch, and duration. The howl alone carries information about individual identity, pack membership, location, and emotional state. When wolves howl together, they're not just making noise. They're sharing information, coordinating activities, reinforcing social bonds, and marking territory. But vocal communication is just part of the story. Wolves communicate constantly through body language, ear position, tail carriage, facial expressions, body posture. They use scent marking to create complex information networks about territory, reproductive status, and individual identity. They touch, nuzzle, and engage in elaborate greeting rituals that strengthen pack cohesion. In other words, wolves had developed something remarkably similar to what humans were developing. Complex social systems based on cooperation, communication, and cultural learning. We were parallel processing the same evolutionary challenges and arriving at surprisingly similar solutions. And here's where I want to pause for just a moment. If you're listening to this right now, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, I'd love to know. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Are you drifting off in California at midnight, starting your morning in Tokyo, somewhere in between? There's something beautiful about the idea of people all over the world, separated by time zones and geography, all learning together about how two species found each other across those same vast distances. All right, back to our story. The geographic range of these ancient wolves was staggering. They had spread across the entire northern hemisphere, adapting to nearly every terrestrial environment except the densest jungles and the most extreme deserts. In North America, wolves range from the Arctic coast to central Mexico. In Europe, from the Mediterranean to the Arctic Circle. In Asia, from the Middle East to Japan, from the Himalayas to the northern coast of Siberia. This expansion mirrored human migration patterns with eerie precision. When humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge into North America around 15,000 years ago, wolves had been there for thousands of years already. When humans pushed north into Arctic Europe, they found wolves already adapted to those conditions. When humans spread across the grasslands of Central Asia, wolves were their constant companions, even if those early interactions were probably hostile. Both species were following the megafauna herds. Both were apex predators with few natural enemies. Both required extensive territories and couldn't tolerate high densities of their own kind. This created inevitable competition. Humans and wolves were hunting the same prey. Both were efficient enough to affect prey populations. Both were territorial enough to view other predators as threats. The fossil record from this period shows clear evidence of conflict. Human sites with wolf bones showing butchery marks, suggesting wolves were being killed and possibly eaten. Wolf den sites with human bones, though whether these were hunting casualties or scavenged remains is unclear. Most tellingly, there are sites where both human and wolf remains show evidence of violence. Broken bones, embedded projectile points in wolf skeletons, human bones with carnivore tooth marks. But there's also evidence of something else, something harder to quantify but visible in the archaeological record if you know where to look. Human sites where wolf bones appear regularly but show no butchery marks. Not food, then. So what were wolves doing at human campsites? Wolf territories that seem to overlap with human territories without evidence of constant conflict. How were two apex predators sharing the same space without destroying each other? And here's the really strange part. Around 40,000 years ago, something began changing in wolf populations near human settlements. The bones start showing subtle differences, slightly shorter snouts, slightly smaller teeth, skeletal proportions that don't quite match wild wolves from other regions. These aren't dramatic changes, not yet, but they're there, measurable, real. Something was happening at the boundary between these two species. Some wolves were spending enough time near humans, or humans were tolerating certain wolves enough, that evolutionary pressure was beginning to change them. Neither species was trying to create this change. Neither had any concept of domestication or selective breeding. But the process had begun anyway. Think about what had to be true for this to happen. Some wolves had to be less afraid of humans than others. Some humans had to be willing to tolerate wolves near their camps rather than killing them on sight. Both species had to find some reason, some advantage, in proximity to the other. The question that would determine everything was simple. Why? Why would wolves approach humans when we were dangerous competitors? Why would humans tolerate wolves when they were potential threats to our children and food supplies? The answer to that question would reshape both species. But to understand it, we need to see what happened when these two worlds finally collided. When the cautious watching from a distance became something more, when two predators stopped seeing each other as threats and started seeing something else entirely. Now picture this. It's about 40,000 years ago, give or take a few millennia. Your ancestors have spread across Africa, Europe, and Asia. They're sophisticated hunters with complex language, advanced tools, and social networks that span hundreds of miles. They've survived climate disasters that would have destroyed lesser species. They're apex predators, top of the food chain in nearly every environment they occupy. But they're not alone. In the forests and steppes of Ice Age Eurasia, another apex predator is hunting the exact same prey. They're equally intelligent, equally social, equally successful. They've been dominating these landscapes for hundreds of thousands of years, long before humans arrived. They are wolves, and they have absolutely no reason to welcome competition. Think about what this means. Two species of highly intelligent cooperative pack hunters occupying the same ecological niche, both targeting the same herds of mammoth, reindeer and wild horses, both needing enormous territories to support their groups, both willing to defend their kills against competitors. In ecology, there's a principle called competitive exclusion. When two species compete for exactly the same resources, one of them usually wins and the other goes extinct or gets pushed into a different niche. It's not malicious, it's just math. The territory can only support so many large predators. So the meeting between humans and wolves should have ended in one of three ways. Humans exterminate wolves as competitors. Wolves make human expansion so difficult that we retreat, to warmer climates where wolves don't dominate. Or both species avoid each other carefully, dividing up territories and prey species to minimize conflict. Instead, something completely unprecedented happened. Something that had never occurred between two competing apex predators in the entire history of life on Earth. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand what those initial encounters were actually like. Not the Disney version where a wolf puppy befriends a human child. The real version, where two species of sophisticated predators sized each other up and had to decide whether the other was competition, potential prey, or something else entirely. The archaeological evidence for these early interactions is subtle but revealing. At sites across Europe and Asia dating to between 40,000 and 30,000 years ago, we find something curious: human camps with wolf bones nearby. Not wolf skeletons that were hunted and butchered for meat. The cut marks aren't right for that. These are mostly wolf bones that show signs of being gnawed by other wolves. Scavenged bones. Leftovers. What this tells us is that wolves were coming close to human settlements. Close enough to scavenge whatever humans left behind. Close enough that they were willing to risk proximity to another apex predator for access to easy food. This is the foundation of what researchers call the dump theory of dog domestication. The idea is simple. Humans kill large animals. Humans eat what they can and leave the rest. That leftover biomass, bones with scraps of meat, discarded organs, fat and marrow, represents a significant food source. Any wolf smart enough to exploit it without getting killed would have a survival advantage. But here's where it gets interesting. Not just any wolf could do this. Think about wolf behavior. Wolves are deeply suspicious of anything unfamiliar. They have huge territories, sometimes hundreds of square miles, and they avoid areas with lots of human activity. A wolf that wanders into a human camp is taking an enormous risk. So the wolves that started scavenging near human settlements weren't average wolves. They were the bold ones, the curious ones, the individuals whose fear response was slightly less hair-triggered than their pack mates. In wolf terms, they were the weirdos, and on the human side, most humans probably saw wolves as competitors or threats. Wolves could steal kills. Wolves could potentially prey on human children or elderly group members. Wolves were dangerous. The logical response would be to drive them off or kill them. But some humans apparently didn't. Some humans tolerated wolves scavenging near their camps. Maybe they recognized that wolves weren't actually competing directly because they were only taking scraps humans couldn't use anyway. Maybe they found the presence of wolves useful as an early warning system against other predators. Maybe they were just curious about these other, intelligent social hunters. Whatever the reason, a pattern began to emerge. Certain wolves, the boldest and least fearful ones, would approach closer to human camps. Certain humans, the most tolerant or curious ones, wouldn't kill them, and gradually over many generations both species started adapting to this strange new relationship. But the dump theory alone doesn't explain everything, because there's another body of evidence that suggests something more active was happening, something that required cooperation, not just tolerance. Enter the hunting partnership theory. The archaeological record from Ice Age Europe shows something remarkable. At some sites, we find evidence of humans and wolves hunting the same prey herds at the same time, possibly even working together. The evidence is subtle. It's in the patterns of how prey animals were killed and processed. It's in the distribution of human tools and wolf remains across the landscape. It's in the types of animals being hunted. Here's the thing about Ice Age megafauna. Many of them were absolutely enormous. A woolly mammoth could weigh 6 tons. A woolly rhinoceros weighed 3 tons. Even the reindeer and wild horses were larger and more dangerous than their modern descendants. Taking down these animals was difficult and dangerous for both humans and wolves. But humans and wolves had complementary hunting strategies. Wolves were faster, had better endurance, better sense of smell. They could track prey over long distances and chase animals to exhaustion. But they had trouble with the kill itself when dealing with very large prey. Their teeth and jaws, while powerful, weren't always enough to bring down a mammoth or a rhino quickly. Humans, on the other hand, had projectile weapons, spears that could be thrown from a distance, atlatls that could add velocity and penetrating power. But humans were slower. We couldn't chase animals for hours across the tundra. We couldn't track as well by scent. We needed animals that were already tired or cornered. You see where this is going? A wolf pack that could drive large prey toward waiting human hunters. Human hunters who could wound and weaken animals that wolves could then finish off. It wouldn't have required much coordination. It could have started accidentally, with wolves and humans independently targeting the same herd and discovering that they were more successful when both species were present. Over time, both species would have learned to recognize and even seek out these situations. Wolves noticing that hunting near humans often meant better success rates. Humans noticing that when wolves showed up, prey animals were already on the move and easier to ambush. The key thing to understand is that both species were capable of learning from observation. Wolves are incredibly intelligent social learners. They watch each other, imitate successful behaviors, teach their young through demonstration. And humans? We're the ultimate observational learners. We can watch another species hunting and figure out their strategies. So imagine you're a human hunter 35,000 years ago. You've been watching wolf packs for years. You know how they hunt. You know they tend to drive prey in specific directions based on wind and terrain. You know the signs that they're about to make a kill, the changes in their body language, their vocalizations, their pack formation. You start positioning yourself along the routes wolves tend to drive their prey. Sometimes you get there just as a kill is happening. Sometimes the wolves have already eaten, and you can scavenge what's left. Sometimes your presence actually helps the wolves by cutting off the prey's escape route. And from the wolf perspective, you're watching these upright apes with their sharp sticks. You notice that when they're around, large prey animals often end up wounded and easier to bring down. You notice they leave behind massive amounts of edible material after their kills. You start tolerating their presence. Eventually you start seeking them out. Neither species would have thought of this as cooperation. Not at first. Both were just being opportunistic, exploiting the presence of another predator to make hunting easier. But opportunism, repeated over thousands of years, can create patterns that look surprisingly like partnership. The physical evidence for all this is frustratingly indirect. We have sites with human and wolf remains in close proximity. We have prey animals that show both wolf bite marks and human tool marks. We have wolf bones that show these animals were being killed and buried by humans, suggesting some level of intentional relationship. But we don't have videos. We can't know exactly how these interactions played out. What we can say with confidence is that something remarkable was happening. The competitive exclusion that should have occurred between humans and wolves didn't happen. Instead, both species were finding ways to coexist, and not just coexist, but potentially benefit from each other's presence. This required something extraordinary from both sides. It required humans to overcome their instinct to eliminate competing predators. It required wolves to overcome their deep suspicion of unfamiliar creatures. It required both species to observe each other carefully, learn each other's patterns, and gradually reduce the fear that normally keeps apex predators apart. Think about what that fear reduction would have looked like in practice. At first, maybe wolves would only approach human camps at night when humans were asleep. Humans might tolerate wolves at 100 yards but drive them off if they came closer. Gradually, over many generations, those distances would shrink. Wolves that could approach to 50 yards without fleeing. Humans who didn't automatically throw rocks at wolves that came within sight. This wasn't a sudden friendship. This was a gradual, multi-generational process of two intelligent species learning that the other wasn't as dangerous as instinct suggested, learning that there might be benefits to proximity, learning to read each other's signals and respond appropriately. And here's the crucial detail. This learning wasn't random, it was selection. Wolves that were too fearful never got close enough to benefit from human food waste and missed out on easier hunting opportunities. Wolves that were too bold got killed by humans who saw them as threats. The sweet spot was being bold enough to approach, but smart enough to read human signals and retreat when necessary. On the human side, groups that killed every wolf on sight eliminated a potential ally. Groups that tolerated any wolf behavior put themselves at risk. The successful groups were the ones who could distinguish between wolves that were just scavenging and wolves that were actually threatening. The ones who could tolerate proximity without surrendering caution. This is natural selection operating simultaneously on two species. But it's not the kind of selection that usually drives evolution. This is selection for cooperation between competitors. Selection for communication across species boundaries. Selection for the ability to form bonds that evolution never planned for. And over thousands of years it was creating something new. Not wolves, not quite, and not dogs, not yet, but something in between. Something the world had never seen before. Here's where the story takes a turn that most people never expect. For decades we told ourselves a comfortable narrative. Humans were the masters, the innovators, the species that conquered nature. We found wolf puppies, raised them, bred the tame ones, and gradually created dogs through our superior intelligence and planning. We were the architects of domestication. The wolves were just raw material. Except that's probably not what happened at all. The revolution in thinking started quietly, in laboratories far from the archaeological sites where researchers had been piecing together dog origins. Scientists began asking uncomfortable questions. How did domestication happen so fast? Why did it happen independently in multiple locations? And most importantly, why would wild wolves, apex predators who had successfully avoided humans for hundreds of thousands of years, suddenly decide that living near us was a good idea? The answer might be simpler and more profound than anyone imagined. The wolves chose us. Or more precisely, some wolves chose us, and that choice changed everything. Let's start with what sounds like a completely unrelated story. 1959, Soviet Union. A geneticist named Dmitry Belyaev starts an experiment that seems almost absurdly simple. He's going to breed foxes, not for fur quality, not for size, not for any physical characteristic. He's going to breed them for one trait only: tameness, how they react to humans. Belyaev wasn't trying to recreate dog domestication. He was trying to understand evolution itself. But what happened next would revolutionize our understanding of how wolves became dogs. He started with wild silver foxes, animals that would bite, scratch, and panic when humans approached. From each generation, he selected only the calmest individuals, the ones that showed the least fear and aggression toward their human handlers. Just that one criterion. Nothing else mattered. Then he bred those calm foxes together and repeated the process with their offspring. Within 6 generations, something remarkable happened. Some fox pups started wagging their tails when humans approached. By 10 generations, some were seeking out human contact, whimpering for attention like puppies. By 20 generations, the change was dramatic. These foxes would lick human hands, follow people around, compete for affection. They had become, essentially, dog-like. But here's where it gets really weird. Belyaev hadn't selected for any physical traits, only behavior. Yet the tame foxes started changing physically. Their ears began to flop, their tails curled, their snouts became shorter. Some developed patches of white fur, especially on their faces and chests. Their breeding seasons lengthened. Their stress hormone levels dropped. Even their brain chemistry changed, with higher serotonin levels making them more relaxed and social. This collection of physical changes appearing together in domesticated animals is called domestication syndrome, and it shows up in dogs, in domesticated pigs, in cattle, in rabbits. Anywhere humans have domesticated animals, we see the same cluster of traits. Floppy ears, curled tails, shortened snouts, piebald colouring, extended breeding seasons. For years, scientists assumed humans had deliberately selected for these traits because we found them cute or useful. But Belyaev's experiment proved otherwise. Select only for tameness, for reduced fear and aggression toward humans, and all these physical changes come along for the ride. It's a package deal. The reason has to do with something called neural crest cells. During early development, these cells migrate through the embryo and contribute to forming multiple body systems. The ears, the tail, the pigmentation cells, the adrenal glands that produce stress hormones, even parts of the skull and jaw. When you select for tameness, you're essentially selecting for changes in how these neural crest cells develop. Calmer animals have altered neural crest cell migration, and that single change cascades through multiple body systems, creating all those physical changes we associate with domestication. Now think about wolves 30,000 years ago. Humans are scattered across landscapes in small groups, creating something that hadn't existed before. Concentrated, predictable food waste, bones with scraps of meat, discarded internal organs, leftovers from successful hunts. For a carnivore, this is an opportunity, but it's also terrifying because humans are dangerous, unpredictable, and armed with weapons that can kill at a distance. Most wolves would avoid human camps completely. The risk was too high. But in any wolf population, there's natural variation in behavior. Most individuals are appropriately cautious. Some are too fearful, missing opportunities because they're too scared to take any risks. And a few, just a few, are bolder, less reactive to potential threats, more willing to investigate novel situations. These bold wolves had a problem in the natural world. Boldness can get you killed. Taking unnecessary risks around large prey, approaching other predators' territories, investigating unknown situations, all of that reduces survival. Natural selection typically weeds out the too bold individuals, but near human camps, boldness suddenly became an advantage. The wolves cautious enough to stay away got none of the abundant human-generated food. The wolves too bold might get killed if they became aggressive or too intrusive. But the wolves who hit the sweet spot, bold enough to approach human camps but not so bold they became threatening, they thrived. Think about what this means. These wolves were self-selecting. No human had to capture them. No one had to deliberately breed them. They were choosing a new ecological niche, one that had literally never existed before. The dump site niche. The scavenger near humans niche. And that choice triggered everything else. The boldest wolves would have better access to food. Better nutrition means more surviving puppies. Those puppies would inherit, at least partially, their parents' reduced fearfulness. Some would be even bolder through natural genetic variation. The boldest of those would have the best access to human refuse. Generation by generation, the population living near humans would become tamer and tamer without any human intervention required. And as they became tamer, Belyaev's experiment tells us exactly what would happen next. Their ears would start to flop, their tails would curl, their snouts would shorten, their coats would develop patches of white. All the physical changes we associate with dogs would emerge automatically as side effects of selection for tameness. The genetic evidence supports this scenario beautifully. When scientists compared dog DNA to wolf DNA, they find that many of the genes that differ between the two species are related to neural development and behavior, particularly genes involved in processing fear and aggression. The physical differences, the obvious changes in appearance, those often involve relatively few genes. But the behavioral changes involve hundreds of genetic variations scattered across the genome. This suggests that behavior changed first and changed most dramatically. The physical transformation followed as a consequence, not as a goal. But here's the crucial part that makes this truly coevolution rather than just wolf self-domestication. Humans had to tolerate it. Imagine you're living 30,000 years ago. You're in a small band of maybe 20 people, struggling to survive in an environment where everything is trying to kill you. Food is never guaranteed. Danger is constant. And now wolves, the same predators that compete with you for prey and occasionally attack humans, are starting to hang around your camp. Your first instinct would be to kill them or drive them away. Many groups probably did exactly that. But some groups, for whatever reason, tolerated the presence of these scavenging wolves. Maybe they noticed that the wolves barked warnings when other predators approached. Maybe they appreciated how the wolves cleaned up waste that might attract more dangerous scavengers. Maybe they just found them interesting, the way we're drawn to watch wildlife today. Whatever the reason, human tolerance was essential. Without it, the self-domesticating wolves would have been killed off. The boldest individuals, the ones most willing to approach humans, would have been the first to die. Natural selection would have pushed wolves back toward wariness and avoidance. But some human groups didn't kill the scavenger wolves. They let them be, and in doing so they created a selective pressure that had never existed before. Suddenly, being comfortable around humans was the most important survival trait a wolf could have. More important than hunting skills. More important than pack hierarchy. More important than territory defense. The wolves living near humans were entering a new evolutionary pathway. They were becoming something else, and the speed of the change would have been remarkable. Belyaev's foxes showed dramatic behavioral changes in just 6 generations. Even accounting for longer generation times in wolves, you could go from wild wolves to dog-like wolves in just a few hundred years. A blink of an eye in evolutionary terms. The archaeological record hints at this process. The earliest wolf remains found in human settlements don't look much different from wild wolves, but they're there in human spaces, suggesting some level of tolerance. Over time, the remains start showing subtle changes. Slightly shorter snouts, different tooth patterns suggesting dietary changes. Eventually clearly dog-like skeletons appearing across multiple continents, often with evidence of careful burial, suggesting these animals had become important to human communities. But the most compelling evidence comes from studying how modern dogs behave differently from wolves in one crucial way. It's not about following commands or learning tricks. It's something much more fundamental. Dogs are geniuses at reading human social cues. Show a dog where food is hidden by pointing, and most dogs understand immediately. They follow your gesture, your gaze, your attention. Wolves, even wolves raised by humans from puppyhood, are terrible at this. They don't naturally tune into human communication. This difference isn't just training, it's genetic. Dogs have evolved specialized cognitive abilities for understanding human behavior, and those abilities would have been enormously valuable for wolves trying to survive in the human-adjacent niche. The wolves who could read human moods, who could tell the difference between a human who might toss them scraps and one who might throw stones, who could predict human behavior and respond appropriately, those wolves would have had massive advantages. So selection wasn't just for tameness. It was for social intelligence specifically tuned to humans. The wolves were evolving to understand us, generation by generation, becoming more and more specialized for a life intertwined with human society. And humans were changing too, though we rarely think about it this way. Groups with proto-dogs would have had advantages over groups without them. Better warning systems, help with hunting, clean-up crews that reduced disease and attracted fewer dangerous scavengers. Companionship in a harsh world. These advantages would have made human-dog partnerships more successful, spreading the practice through cultural learning and perhaps even providing demographic advantages. Two species, evolving together, each changing in response to the other, not master and servant, not creator and creation, partners in an evolutionary dance that neither fully controlled. The wolves chose to approach. Humans chose to tolerate, and from those two choices, everything else followed. The transformation wasn't instant, wasn't deliberate, wasn't planned by either species. It emerged from the interaction, from wolves brave enough to try something new and humans wise enough to let them try. But here's where the story takes a turn that nobody saw coming. Not the humans, not the wolves, and certainly not the Neanderthals who were about to find themselves in a competition they didn't even know they were losing. Those early dogs, the ones who had chosen to live alongside humans, weren't just companions. They were weapons. They were early warning systems. They were the evolutionary advantage that would tip the balance of survival in favor of one human species over all the others. Let's start with hunting, because that's where the advantage became immediately obvious. Before dogs, human hunters had to rely entirely on their own senses. You're tracking a herd of deer through dense forest. You can see maybe 50 yards ahead on a good day. You can hear reasonably well, but wind direction matters, and prey animals have evolved for millions of years to detect predators. You're good at persistence hunting, wearing down prey over long distances, but you're burning massive amounts of calories doing it. And half the time, after hours of tracking, the herd catches your scent at the last moment and disappears before you get within spear range. Now add a dog to this scenario. Actually, add 3 or 4 dogs. Suddenly everything changes. The dogs can smell that deer herd from half a mile away. They can track scent trails that are hours old, leading you directly to where the animals are bedded down. They can circle around and drive the herd toward you instead of away. They can pursue fleeing animals through terrain where humans would break their ankles. Most importantly, they can do the exhausting work of the chase while you, the human, save your energy for the kill itself. Archaeological evidence suggests that human groups with dogs could bring down 50% more large game than groups without them. 50%. That's not a minor advantage. That's the difference between starvation and plenty, between a group barely surviving and a group thriving enough to support more children, more elders, more specialization of labor. But hunting was just the beginning. Dogs transformed human security in ways that are hard to overstate. Picture a human camp 35,000 years ago. No dogs. You're sleeping in a cave or a simple shelter. Outside in the darkness, predators move. Cave lions, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves. All of them perfectly happy to kill sleeping humans if the opportunity presents itself. So, you post guards. Someone has to stay awake all night, every night, watching for threats. That's exhausting. Human guards get tired, they get distracted, they miss things in the darkness. Now add dogs to the camp. They sleep lightly. Their hearing is 4 times more sensitive than yours. Their sense of smell detects approaching predators long before any human could, and they bark. That simple innovation, the alarm bark, changed everything. Suddenly every member of the group could sleep through the night. The dogs would alert them to any danger with plenty of time to respond. This sounds minor until you understand the metabolic cost of sleep deprivation. Humans who don't sleep well are less effective at everything. They make worse decisions. They're less alert during the day. They're more prone to accidents and disease. Groups that could sleep soundly every night because dogs were watching had a massive survival advantage over groups that couldn't. And then there's the Neanderthal question. This is where things get really interesting and controversial. Neanderthals were successful for 400,000 years. They were stronger than modern humans. They had larger brains. They were superbly adapted to Ice Age Europe. They were expert hunters who could take down mammoths and woolly rhinoceros with nothing but spears and coordination. But by 40,000 years ago, they were gone, extinct. What happened? There are lots of theories. Climate change, disease, direct competition with modern humans. But here's the thing that doesn't get enough attention. The timeline of Neanderthal extinction closely matches the timeline of dog domestication. Modern humans arrived in Europe with dogs. Neanderthals, as far as we can tell, never domesticated wolves. They had 400,000 years to do it. They were smart enough. They were capable enough, but for whatever reason it never happened. And then modern humans showed up with wolf packs that hunted for them, guarded them while they slept, and helped them track game across vast territories. The archaeological record shows a dramatic shift. Modern human sites from this period are larger, more permanent, with evidence of much more successful hunting. Neanderthal sites from the same period show signs of stress, fewer large kills, more dependence on smaller game, evidence of nutritional deficiencies. Some anthropologists think dogs gave modern humans the edge they needed to outcompete Neanderthals for resources. Not through direct violence necessarily, though that probably happened too, but through simple ecological dominance. Modern humans with dogs could hunt more effectively, exploit territories more thoroughly, and support larger populations. Neanderthals without this advantage slowly lost ground. Group by group over thousands of years, they dwindled until the last populations vanished around 39,000 years ago. We'll never know for certain. But the coincidence is striking. The only human species that survived was the one that had partnered with wolves. Dogs also changed where and how humans could live. Before dogs, human groups were limited in size by the need for everyone to contribute to hunting and gathering. You couldn't support many specialists. Can't feed a toolmaker who doesn't hunt if hunting success is marginal. But with dogs making hunting more efficient, suddenly you have surplus. Food security, the ability to support people who do things other than acquire calories. This is when human settlements start becoming more permanent, more complex. Archaeological sites from the period after dog domestication show evidence of specialized craftspeople, elaborate artwork, complex social hierarchies. You see the first evidence of long-distance trade networks, suggesting some people were traveling extensively while others stayed home. This kind of specialization is only possible when food acquisition is reliable enough that not everyone needs to do it. Dogs enabled this. By increasing hunting success and providing security, they freed up human time and energy for innovation, for art, for technology development, for this slow accumulation of knowledge that would eventually lead to agriculture, civilization, everything we think of as human achievement. But perhaps the most profound change was happening inside the human brain itself. This is where the story gets really subtle and really weird. When a human and a dog look into each other's eyes, something remarkable happens. Both brains start releasing oxytocin, the same hormone that bonds mothers to infants. This isn't learned. This isn't cultural. This is hardwired neurochemistry that evolved over thousands of years of coexistence. No other interspecies relationship produces this response. Humans looking at wolves don't get an oxytocin spike. Wolves looking at humans don't either. But humans and dogs, they've co-evolved a biochemical bonding mechanism that exists nowhere else in nature. This suggests something profound happened to human brain architecture during the domestication process. We didn't just change dogs, they changed us. Natural selection favored humans who could bond with dogs, who could read dog body language, who felt protective toward these animals that were making their lives easier. Over hundreds of generations, this reshaped human emotional responses made us more empathetic, more attuned to the emotional states of other species. Some neuroscientists think this was the template for expanded human empathy generally. Once we developed the neural machinery to care about another species, to read their emotions and respond to their needs, that same machinery could be applied to other humans, to strangers, not just kin, to people from different groups. The capacity for large-scale cooperation that defines human civilization might have started with learning to cooperate with dogs. There's also the cognitive resource question. This one's more speculative, but the logic is compelling. Human brains are expensive. They consume 20% of our metabolic energy, despite being only 2% of our body weight. Every cognitive task we perform has a caloric cost. Before dogs, humans had to invest enormous mental energy in constant vigilance, watching for predators, tracking prey, monitoring the environment for threats and opportunities. This vigilance is exhausting. It takes up processing power that could be used for other things. Dogs took over much of this work. They watched for threats. They tracked game. They monitored the environment. This freed up human cognitive resources for other developments. Abstract thinking, planning, innovation, art. Language becomes more complex when you're not constantly diverting mental energy towards survival vigilance. Some researchers think this cognitive offloading was essential for the development of symbolic thinking and abstract reasoning that characterize modern human cognition. We could become more creative, more innovative, more capable of complex thought precisely because we had allies handling the cognitive heavy lifting of constant environmental monitoring. It's like getting a massive RAM upgrade for a computer. Suddenly processes that were running slowly or not at all can execute smoothly, because resources have been freed up. Dogs were our cognitive RAM upgrade. They expanded our mental capacity by taking over tasks we'd previously had to handle ourselves. And here's the thing that really should blow your mind. This all happened without anyone planning it. There was no human council that decided to domesticate wolves for tactical advantage. There were no wolves holding meetings about the benefits of befriending humans. This was emergent evolution. Two species changing each other through thousands of years of proximity, cooperation, and mutual selection pressure. The humans who were better at working with dogs survived more often. The dogs who were better at working with humans got fed more reliably. Generation after generation, the partnership deepened, until you ended up with species that had literally co-evolved. Humans became more dog-like in some ways, more social, more communicative, more attuned to subtle emotional cues. Dogs became more human-like, capable of reading our gestures, responding to our emotions, even understanding our words. By 15,000 years ago, the transformation was complete. Humans and dogs had been living together for so long that neither species could really be understood without reference to the other. We had shaped them into hundreds of specialized forms: hunting dogs, guarding dogs, herding dogs, even lap dogs bred purely for companionship. They had shaped us into a species capable of unprecedented cooperation, empathy, and cognitive flexibility. And through all of this, through the genetic changes and the cognitive evolution and the social transformation, one thing remained constant. When a human and a dog look at each other, really look, there's recognition there. A connection that spans two entirely different evolutionary lineages. A bond that started by accident in the shadows of an Ice Age campfire and ended up changing the fate of both species forever. We think we domesticated dogs, but the truth is more complex. We domesticated each other. And in the process, we both became something we couldn't have been alone. For most of human history, the story of how wolves became dogs was just that. A story. We had myths, archaeological hints, educated guesses. But we didn't have proof. We couldn't read the actual record written in the cells of every dog that's ever lived. Then in 1953, Watson and Crick figured out the structure of DNA. And suddenly, after millions of years of evolution happening in darkness, we could finally turn on the lights and see what had actually occurred. But it would take decades before the technology caught up to the ambition. You couldn't just sequence ancient DNA in the 1950s or the 60s or even the 80s. The tools didn't exist. The computers weren't powerful enough. The theoretical framework was still being developed. Scientists were working blind, trying to understand domestication using only bones and stone tools and inference. That started changing in the 1990s. The first complete genome of a living organism was sequenced in 1995. Not a human, not a dog, but a bacterium. Just 1.8 million base pairs, simple compared to what was coming. By 1997, researchers had published the first genetic study comparing dogs and wolves. They looked at mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down only through mothers, and found something remarkable. Despite all their physical differences, despite 15,000 years or more of separation, dogs and wolves were incredibly similar at the genetic level, more similar than anyone had expected. The DNA suggested dogs had diverged from wolves relatively recently in evolutionary terms. But recently how? That's where things got complicated. The first estimates put dog domestication at around 15,000 years ago. This made sense. It matched up nicely with the archaeological record of early agricultural settlements. Dogs appeared in the fossil record right when humans were transitioning from hunter-gatherers to farmers. Perfect timing. Everything fit into a neat narrative. Humans settled down, started growing crops, and attracted wolves that eventually became dogs. Then in 2013, everything exploded. A team of researchers sequenced the complete genome of an ancient wolf that had died 35,000 years ago. Its remains had been preserved in the Siberian permafrost, frozen solid for millennia, DNA intact. When they compared this ancient wolf's genome to modern dogs and modern wolves, they found something nobody expected. The ancient wolf was genetically closer to dogs than modern wolves are. This shouldn't have been possible if dogs only split from wolves 15,000 years ago. The math didn't work. Either dogs were much older than we thought, or something very strange had happened to wolf genetics in the meantime. Within a few years, other teams were publishing contradictory findings. Some genetic studies suggested dogs originated 40,000 years ago. Others said 20,000. A few outliers claimed even earlier dates. Different research groups using different methods were getting wildly different answers. Then came the bombshell. In 2016, a massive genetic study looked at ancient dog DNA from across Europe and Asia. The researchers found evidence that dogs might have been domesticated not once but twice, independently, in two different places. They proposed that one group of wolves became dogs in Europe, another group became dogs in East Asia, and then eventually these two domesticated populations met and interbred. This would explain why the genetic data was so messy. We weren't looking at one clean domestication event. We were looking at multiple origins that had gotten tangled together. The debate exploded. Some researchers embraced the dual origin theory. Others rejected it outright, arguing that the genetic patterns could be explained by later migrations and population mixing without requiring two separate domestication events. Papers were published, rebuttals were written, academic conferences became battlegrounds of competing interpretations. But here's what makes this controversy so fascinating. It's not that the data is wrong. It's that the story is complicated. Evolution isn't a straight line. It's a tangled mess of populations splitting, merging, going extinct, hybridizing. The simple narrative, one place, one time, one group of wolves becoming dogs, was always too clean to be true. Reality is messier. Think about it like this. You're trying to trace your family tree back 30,000 years using only genetic evidence. No written records, no oral histories, just DNA. You might find that your ancestors came from multiple populations that mixed at various times. You might discover that some of your lineage came from people who went extinct thousands of years ago, their genes surviving only through interbreeding with other groups. The story wouldn't be simple. It would be layered, complex, full of dead ends and surprising connections. That's what researchers are finding with dog genetics. Ancient dog populations that existed for thousands of years and then vanished, leaving only faint genetic traces in modern breeds. Regional populations that were isolated for millennia before contact and mixing. Episodes of massive population turnover where entire dog populations were replaced by newcomers. One study analysed DNA from a 5,000-year-old dog found at an archaeological site in Ireland. They compared it to modern dogs and found something startling. This ancient Irish dog was genetically distinct from all modern dogs. Its lineage had gone completely extinct. Whatever population of ancient dogs lived in Ireland 5,000 years ago, they didn't contribute DNA to any dogs alive today. They were replaced, probably by dogs brought by migrating human populations during the Bronze Age. This pattern shows up everywhere researchers look. Ancient dog DNA from the Middle East doesn't match modern Middle Eastern dogs. Ancient dogs from Siberia are genetically different from modern Siberian dogs. Ancient European dogs left a little trace in modern European breeds. The implication is staggering. The dogs we see today represent only a tiny fraction of the genetic diversity that once existed in ancient dog populations. Thousands of years of dog evolution, countless lineages, entire regional populations, most of it is gone. Lost to extinction, replaced by expansion of other dog populations as human societies grew, migrated, and conquered. But extinction tells us something important. It means dog evolution wasn't finished just because wolves became dogs. The process continued. Selection pressures kept operating. Some dog populations adapted better to changing conditions. Others failed and disappeared. This was evolution in action, ongoing, relentless, and we can see exactly what was changing. The genetic differences between dogs and wolves aren't random. They're clustered in specific areas of the genome, genes that control very particular traits. Researchers have now identified dozens of genetic regions that show clear signatures of selection during domestication. These are the places where dog DNA diverged most strongly from wolf DNA, where evolution was pushing hardest to create something new. The most obvious changes involve appearance. Dogs look different from wolves because specific genes controlling body size, coat colour, ear shape and tail carriage were modified during domestication. A gene, called IGF-1, determines body size. Variations in this gene are why you can have both Chihuahuas and Great Danes. Ancient dogs show intermediate forms, suggesting that extreme size variation came later, after the initial domestication event. Coat colour is even more interesting. Wolves are generally grey or brown, colours that provide camouflage. Dogs come in almost every colour imaginable. Spotted, striped, solid black, solid white. Combinations that would make a wolf stand out like a beacon. This didn't happen by accident. As soon as wolves started living with humans, natural camouflage became less important. Maybe humans actively preferred dogs with unusual colours because they were easier to distinguish from wild wolves. Maybe unusual colouring was simply a side effect of breeding for tameness. Either way, the genetic changes happened fast. Ancient dog remains from 10,000 years ago show dogs that already came in multiple colours. But the really fascinating genetic changes are the ones you can't see. Behavioural traits, cognitive abilities, the internal architecture that makes dogs different from wolves in ways that have nothing to do with appearance. Researchers have identified a cluster of genes on dog chromosome 6 that show extreme divergence from wolves. These genes are involved in brain development and neural function. Variations in this region correlate with differences in social cognition, the ability to read human gestures, respond to human attention, and seek human approval. This is the genetic foundation of what makes dogs, dogs. Their ability to connect with humans at a level no wild animal ever achieved. Then there's the diet story. One of the most remarkable genetic discoveries is that dogs carry multiple copies of a gene called M5B. This gene produces amylase, an enzyme that breaks down starch. Wolves have 1 or 2 copies of this gene. They eat meat almost exclusively, so they don't need much starch digestion. Dogs have anywhere from 4 to 30 copies depending on the breed. This allows them to digest grains, bread, rice, all the starchy foods that became common in human diets once we developed agriculture. Here's what's wild about this. The genetic change didn't happen before domestication. It happened after. Early dogs probably had digestive systems much like wolves, adapted for meat. But as humans transitioned to agriculture and started eating more grain-based foods, the dogs living with them faced a new selection pressure. Dogs that could digest human food scraps would have a huge advantage. They could survive on the waste products of human meals rather than competing with humans for meat. Natural selection responded. Dogs with more copies of the AM-SUD gene could extract more calories from starchy foods. They were healthier, reproduced more successfully, and passed on their enhanced starch digestion to their offspring. Over hundreds of generations, the number of AM2B copies increased in dog populations living with agricultural societies. By 5,000 years ago, dogs in farming communities had already evolved significantly enhanced starch digestion. This is evolution happening in real time, driven by human cultural changes. Different dog populations show different numbers of AM2B copies, corresponding to how much starch was in the diet of the humans they lived with. Dogs from populations with long histories of agriculture have more copies. Dogs from populations that remained hunter-gatherers have fewer. The correlation is so clear it's almost eerie. Dogs didn't just live alongside humans, they adapted to human culture at the genetic level. But perhaps the most profound discovery is how genetically diverse ancient dogs were. Modern dog breeds, for all their superficial variety, are genetically quite similar. They're all descended from a relatively small number of ancestral populations that expanded during the past few thousand years. Ancient dogs were far more diverse. Genetic analysis of archaeological remains shows dog populations separated by just a few hundred miles could be as genetically different as modern wolves and modern dogs. This suggests that early dog domestication wasn't a single event that spread outward. It was happening constantly, everywhere humans and wolves came into contact. Local populations of wolves were becoming local populations of dogs, each adapting to the specific environment and culture of the humans they lived with. These populations remained largely isolated from each other for thousands of years, developing distinct genetic profiles, unique adaptations, different behavioral traits. Most of that diversity is now gone, replaced by genetic homogenization as human populations mixed, migrated, and brought their dogs with them. But for a brief period, maybe 15,000 years, dogs were wildly variable, a mosaic of local forms each telling its own story of domestication. The genetic evidence paints a picture that's more complex, more interesting than any simple origin story could capture. Dogs weren't created in one place and spread. They emerged from a process that was ongoing, distributed, and deeply entangled with human cultural evolution. Every time we sequence another ancient dog genome, we find new surprises, new complications, new branches in the tangled tree of dog ancestry. We still don't have all the answers. The debate about timing and origins continues, but we know more now than we ever have. We can read the actual story written in DNA, preserved across tens of thousands of years, waiting for us to develop the technology to decode it. And what that story tells us is that the bond between humans and dogs was so powerful, so fundamental, that it literally rewrote the genetic code of both species. We changed them. They changed us. And the evidence is right there in every cell. So you've got these wolves, not all wolves, just a subset. The ones brave enough or desperate enough to hang around human settlements. The ones whose bodies produced slightly less cortisol when humans were nearby. The ones who could tolerate being looked at without fleeing or attacking. And now something remarkable begins happening. Something that would transform them so completely that 15,000 years later, a Chihuahua and a grey wolf would technically be the same species, yet look like they came from different planets. The changes started subtle. So subtle that the humans probably didn't notice for generations, maybe centuries. But they were happening, written into the DNA with every generation that chose to stay close to humans, rather than flee into the wilderness. The first shifts were behavioural, which we've already covered. But behaviour and biology aren't separate. They're deeply intertwined. When you select for behaviour, you get physical changes as baggage. Sometimes that baggage becomes the most visible part of the transformation. Here's where it gets fascinating. Those early proto-dogs weren't just becoming tamer, they were becoming younger, or rather, they were staying young, forever. This process is called neoteny, and it's one of the most important concepts for understanding how wolves became dogs. In wild wolves, certain physical and behavioural traits appear only in puppies. Floppy ears, shorter snouts, playfulness, a tendency to whine and seek attention, spotted or piebald coats. As wolves mature, these features disappear. Ears stand upright, snouts elongate. Behaviour becomes more serious, more focused on hierarchy and hunting. Coats settle into adult patterns, usually various shades of grey and brown. But in proto-dogs, something strange happened. The developmental clock slowed down. Features that should have disappeared during adolescence persisted into adulthood. Adult dogs that still looked and acted like wolf puppies. This wasn't random. It was a direct consequence of selecting for tameness. Geneticists have actually replicated this process in modern times. In the 1950s, a Soviet scientist named Dmitry Belyaev started breeding foxes, selecting only for one trait: friendliness toward humans. He didn't care about appearance, didn't select for any physical characteristics, just temperament. Within 10 generations, the foxes started changing. Floppy ears appeared, curled tails, patches of white fur, shorter snouts. The foxes were becoming neotenic, retaining juvenile features into adulthood, and it happened automatically, just from selecting for tameness. Why? Because the genes controlling temperament are linked to the genes controlling development. When you select for reduced fear and aggression, you're selecting for changes in stress hormones, particularly cortisol and adrenaline. These same hormones regulate developmental timing. Lower stress hormone levels mean slower maturation. Slower maturation means juvenile features persisting longer, sometimes permanently. So those first proto-dogs started looking different from wolves, without anyone deliberately trying to change their appearance. Shorter faces, smaller teeth, more varied coat colours. Some probably had floppy ears, though that trait wouldn't become common until much later. They were adult animals with puppy faces, and humans found this irresistible. Because here's the thing, humans are hardwired to respond to juvenile features, large eyes relative to head size, rounded faces, small noses. These traits trigger nurturing instincts in humans. We can't help it. It's why we find human babies cute, why we anthropomorphize cartoon characters with big eyes, why puppies make even the most stoic person smile. Proto-dogs that retained more juvenile features got more positive attention from humans, more food scraps, more tolerance, more protection. They had more offspring. Those offspring inherited the neotenic traits. Generation by generation, the population shifted toward more puppy-like adults. But the transformation went deeper than appearance. The really profound changes were happening in the brain and the vocal cords. Dogs were developing abilities that wolves simply don't have. The capacity to understand human communication in ways that even our closest primate relatives struggle with. Take barking. Adult wolves rarely bark. They howl, they growl, they whine. But sustained barking, that's almost exclusively a puppy behaviour. Wolf pups bark to get attention from their parents. Adult wolves move on to more sophisticated vocalizations. But dogs bark constantly. And not just random barking. Dogs develop the ability to vary their barks to communicate different things. Alarm barks sound different from play barks. Greeting barks differ from threat barks. Dogs basically invented a communication system designed specifically for interacting with humans. This happened because barking was useful in the human-dog relationship. Dogs that bark to alert humans about intruders were valuable. Dogs that barked to communicate their needs were more likely to get fed. Dogs that barked during play strengthened their bond with humans. Natural selection favoured the barkers, even though this trait would be detrimental in wild wolves, where silent communication is essential for hunting success. Then there's the really weird stuff. The cognitive abilities that seem almost like magic. Dogs can read human pointing gestures. This sounds simple, but it's not. When you point at something, you're using an abstract symbol to direct attention. Chimpanzees, our closest relatives, struggle with this. Wolves raised by humans from puppyhood still don't get it reliably. But dogs, even young puppies, understand pointing with minimal training. They've evolved cognitive machinery specifically for decoding human communication. They can follow human gaze direction. They understand when you're looking at something versus looking at nothing. They can interpret human facial expressions, distinguishing between happiness, anger, and sadness. Research has shown that dogs have muscles around their eyes that wolves lack. Muscles that allow them to make the puppy dog eyes expression that humans find so appealing. These muscles evolved specifically for communicating with humans. They serve no function in dog-to-dog communication. They exist only because dogs that could manipulate human emotions through facial expressions had better survival rates. Dogs also evolved the ability to synchronize their behavior with humans in ways that wolves cannot. They can learn to walk on a leash without constant training. they naturally adjust their pace to match human walking speed. They look to humans for guidance in uncertain situations, a behaviour called social referencing that even young children use with their parents. This co-evolution happened fast. Within a few thousand years, dogs had diverged so dramatically from wolves that they were effectively a different creature. Not a different species, technically. They could still interbreed with wolves, but different in every way that mattered for their relationship with humans. And then humans started noticing that different dogs were good at different things. This changed everything. Because now it wasn't just natural selection operating on dogs, it was artificial selection. Deliberate human breeding for specific traits. The earliest evidence suggests humans started breeding dogs for specialized purposes at least 10,000 years ago, probably earlier, but that's where the archaeological record becomes clear. Different types emerge in different regions. Not breeds as we'd recognize them today, but distinct types shaped for specific roles. In cold climates, humans bred for size and heavy coats. Large, powerful dogs that could pull sleds across snow and ice. The ancestors of modern Spitz-type breeds like Huskies and Malamutes. These dogs had thick double coats, powerful shoulders, and incredible endurance. They made Arctic survival possible for humans who lacked horses or other pack animals. In pastoral societies, humans bred for herding instincts. Dogs that had strong prey drive but channeled it into controlling livestock rather than killing them. These dogs needed to be intelligent, responsive to commands, and capable of working independently. They became the ancestors of border collies, shepherds, and healers. Different regions developed different herding styles based on local needs, but all shared the core traits of intelligence and controlled aggression. For hunting, the diversity was even greater. Humans bred sight hounds for chasing fast prey across open terrain. Long legs, deep chests, incredible speed. The ancestors of greyhounds and whippets. In forests, they bred scent hounds with incredible noses and stamina for tracking game over long distances. Bloodhounds and beagles descend from these lines. For hunting in water, humans bred dogs with webbed feet and water-resistant coats. Retrievers who could plunge into icy water to fetch downed birds. For hunting underground, they bred terriers, small but fearless dogs that could pursue rats and rabbits into their burrows. Guard dogs emerged early. Large, intimidating breeds with powerful jaws and protective instincts. Mastiff-type dogs spread across ancient civilizations. From Rome to China, always serving the same basic purpose, protecting property and people from intruders. Ancient Egypt had distinct dog types by 4,000 years ago. Tomb paintings show dogs that look remarkably like modern Salukis and Basenjis. The Pharaoh hound, though actually developed later in Malta, preserves the appearance of ancient Egyptian hunting dogs. These weren't just pets. They were working animals, carefully bred for specific tasks in a complex civilization. China developed its own unique breeds, many of them companion dogs for the imperial court. Pekingese, Shih Tzus and Pugs were bred to be small, decorative and devoted to their human families. These were among the first dogs bred primarily for companionship rather than work, though they still served functions like alerting to intruders and providing warmth on cold nights. But for most of history, dog breeding was relatively restrained. You had types, not breeds. A herding dog from Scotland might look different from a herding dog from Greece, but both were primarily selected for function. Form followed function. Dogs looked the way they did because it helped them do their jobs. Then came the Victorian era, and everything exploded. In the mid-1800s, wealthy Europeans became obsessed with dog breeding as a hobby. Kennel clubs formed. Dog shows became fashionable. Breed standards were written down, specifying exactly how each breed should look. This unleashed artificial selection like never before. Within a century, the number of recognized dog breeds went from perhaps a few dozen to several hundred. Breeders pushed physical traits to extremes. Bulldogs developed increasingly flattened faces, even though it caused breathing problems. Dachshunds got longer backs, despite the spinal issues. German Shepherds developed sloped backs that never existed in working dogs. Not all of this was bad. Some breeds were created to preserve working dog types that were disappearing. Others were developed to revive ancient breeds from historical records. But the focus shifted decisively from function to form, from what dogs could do to what they looked like. Today we have over 400 recognized dog breeds worldwide, from the tiny 2-pound Chihuahua to the 200-pound English Mastiff, from hairless Chinese Cresteds to long-coated Afghan hounds. Dogs with pushed-in faces, dogs with elongated snouts, dogs bred to herd, hunt, guard, track, retrieve, race, fight, and simply sit on laps looking adorable. All of them descended from wolves, all of them carrying the genetic legacy of those first proto-dogs who chose to stay near human fires instead of fleeing into the darkness. All of them shaped by thousands of generations of coevolution with humans, then a few hundred years of intensive selective breeding. The transformation was complete. Wolves had become dogs. Wild predators had become domestic companions so diverse that many breeds looked nothing like their ancestors. Yet underneath all that diversity, underneath all those centuries of breeding and selection, every dog still carries wolf DNA, still shares the same scientific classification, still capable, theoretically, of producing offspring with wild wolves. They just never would. Because dogs and wolves aren't just genetically different, they're cognitively different, behaviorally different, fundamentally different in their relationship to humans. Dogs have evolved to live with us in ways that wolves never could, and in doing so, they've become something entirely new. Not wolves, not quite separate from wolves, but something in between. Something that exists only because humans exist. Something we created together. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Dogs didn't just spread with humans, they transformed differently in every place they went. The relationship between dogs and humans wasn't one universal story. It was thousands of stories, each culture developing its own unique bond, its own understanding of what dogs meant and how they fit into human society. And yet, despite all this diversity, something remained constant. Everywhere humans went, dogs came with them, and everywhere they arrived together, something profound happened between the two species. Let's start in ancient Egypt, around 3000 BCE. By this time, dogs had been living with humans for at least 12,000 years, maybe longer. But the Egyptians took the relationship to a level that would have seemed bizarre to earlier peoples. They didn't just use dogs for hunting and guarding. They worshipped them. The god Anubis had a jackal's head, or maybe it was a dog's. Scholars still argue about this, but the distinction didn't matter to the Egyptians. What mattered was that the god who guided souls to the afterlife, who weighed hearts against the feather of truth, who stood between the living and the dead, looked like a canine. This wasn't random symbolism. Dogs in Egypt served as guardians, yes, but also as companions in death. When wealthy Egyptians died, their dogs were often mummified and buried with them, not as sacrifices, but as companions. The Egyptians believed that the bond between human and dog was so strong it could transcend death itself. Archaeological evidence backs this up. Dog mummies have been found carefully wrapped, treated with the same reverence as human remains. Some even show evidence of medical treatment during life, broken bones that were set and healed, suggesting these weren't just working animals but valued members of the household. The Egyptians had multiple words for dogs, distinguishing between hunting dogs, guard dogs, and companion animals. They had breeding programs that produced distinct types. greyhound-like sighthounds for hunting gazelles in the desert, mastiff types for guarding estates and temples, smaller dogs that seem to have served purely as companions, the ancient equivalent of lapdogs. But here's what's remarkable. Even with all this specialization, even with dogs serving such different roles in Egyptian society, they were all still fundamentally dogs, the same species, the same basic behavioral traits, just shaped differently by human needs and preferences. Now jump across the world to the Americas. Before European contact, indigenous peoples across both continents had developed their own relationships with dogs. These relationships looked nothing like what was happening in Egypt or anywhere else in the Old World. In many indigenous American cultures, dogs weren't just companions or workers. They were family members, spiritual beings, sometimes even ancestors. The Inuit peoples of the Arctic had developed dog breeds perfectly adapted to one of the harshest environments on Earth. These weren't the chunky, fluffy huskies we imagine today. Those came later. The original Inuit dogs were lean, tough animals capable of pulling sleds across hundreds of miles of frozen tundra in temperatures that would kill most mammals. But they were more than just transportation. Inuit oral traditions describe dogs as teachers, as beings who showed humans how to survive in the Arctic. Some stories say that in the ancient times dogs and humans could speak to each other, that they made a covenant. Dogs would help humans survive the cold, and humans would care for dogs in return. When that deal was made, the stories say, dogs lost the ability to speak human languages, but gained the ability to understand them. Further south, the peoples of the Great Plains had developed a completely different relationship with dogs. Before horses arrived, dogs were the primary beasts of burden. They pulled travois laden with household goods as entire communities moved following bison herds. Plains cultures had elaborate rituals around dogs. The Lakota had a sacred dog feast, not as casual consumption, but as a profound spiritual ceremony reserved for the most important occasions. Eating dog wasn't about hunger. It was about incorporating the spiritual power and loyalty of the dog into the community. When Europeans first encountered these practices, they were horrified. But they missed the point entirely. This wasn't cruelty, it was reverence. The dog was considered so sacred that consuming it in ritual context was one of the highest honours that could be bestowed. In ancient China, meanwhile, dogs were playing yet another role in human culture. By 2000 BCE, the Chinese had already developed multiple distinct dog breeds. The Pekingese bred so small they could fit in the sleeves of imperial robes. The Chow Chow, one of the oldest breeds in the world, used for hunting, herding, and guarding. The Chinese relationship with dogs was complex and sometimes contradictory. Dogs were guardians of homes and temples. In Chinese astrology, the dog is one of the 12 zodiac animals, representing loyalty, honesty, and protectiveness. But dogs were also food animals in some regions, livestock bred and raised like any other domestic animal. This wasn't hypocrisy. It was recognition that dogs could serve multiple roles in human society. A guard dog and a food dog weren't the same animal, just like a pet rabbit and a meat rabbit aren't the same thing, even though they're the same species. Japanese culture developed yet another variation on the human-dog relationship. By the 8th century CE, dogs in Japan were associated with protection and loyalty. The Akita breed was developed as a hunting dog for Japanese nobility, capable of taking down bears and wild boar. But the cultural meaning of dogs went deeper. In Shinto belief, dogs could ward off evil spirits. Stone dog statues called komainu guarded temple entrances. The famous story of Hachiko, the Akita who waited for his deceased owner at the train station every day for nearly 10 years, became a national symbol of loyalty and devotion. That story resonates because it captures something universal about dogs, that capacity for devotion, for maintaining bonds even when logic says they should move on. It's something humans recognized and valued across every culture that lived with dogs. In ancient Greece and Rome, dogs were everywhere. The Greeks had a word for the bond between human and dog, philokunia, love of dogs. It was considered a mark of good character. Plato wrote about dogs as the ideal philosophers because they distinguished friend from stranger based on knowledge rather than appearance. Aristotle studied dog behavior and marveled at their intelligence and emotional capacity. The Romans took things further. They developed massive breeding programs, creating dogs specialized for every conceivable purpose. War dogs that accompanied legions into battle, hunting dogs for everything from rabbits to lions, tiny lap dogs for wealthy matrons, guard dogs that were so fearsome they became legendary. The Molossus, ancestor of modern mastiffs, was a war dog that struck terror into Rome's enemies. But Romans also understood something subtle about dogs. They knew that beneath all the specialized breeding, all the different types and purposes, dogs remained fundamentally social animals that needed human connection. Roman writers described dogs sleeping in their owners' beds, playing with children, mourning when separated from their humans. This wasn't sentimentality. It was observation. Recognition that no matter what job a dog was bred to do, it still needed that fundamental bond with humans to thrive. Medieval Europe added another layer to the human-dog story. In feudal society, dogs became markers of social status. Nobility had hunting dogs, elaborate breeds that required extensive training and care. Peasants had working dogs, animals that earned their keep by guarding livestock and catching rats. But the laws around dogs revealed something interesting. In many medieval legal codes, killing another person's dog was a serious crime. Not because the dog had monetary value, though it did, but because the dog was considered part of the household, an extension of the family. Injuring someone's dog was like injuring their child. This legal protection existed across medieval Europe, from England to Poland, suggesting a widespread recognition that dogs weren't just property, but something more complex. Medieval monasteries kept dogs as companions and guards. There are records of monks being reprimanded for spending too much time playing with their dogs instead of praying, which tells you something about the power of the human-dog bond. Even men who had devoted their lives to God couldn't resist the pull of connection with their canine companions. But perhaps the most revealing thing about dogs across cultures is what happened when different cultures met. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Americas, they brought European dog breeds with them. War dogs, hunting dogs. These dogs seemed fundamentally different from indigenous American dogs. Bigger, more aggressive, bred for centuries in Europe's endless wars. Yet within a few generations, these European dogs and indigenous dogs were interbreeding, and the resulting animals showed traits from both lineages. They adapted to New World environments but retained some Old World characteristics. The dogs themselves didn't care about human cultural boundaries. They remained one species, capable of forming the same bonds with humans regardless of which culture those humans belonged to. The same thing happened in reverse. When European explorers encountered Inuit sled dogs or Polynesian voyaging dogs, they recognized them immediately as dogs. Different from European breeds, yes, but fundamentally similar. The capacity to bond with humans, to learn commands, to show loyalty and affection. These traits transcended cultural differences because they weren't cultural traits. They were the product of 30,000 years of coevolution, written into dog DNA and psychology so deeply that no amount of cultural variation could erase them. In Islamic cultures, the relationship with dogs became complicated by religious law. Dogs were considered ritually unclean in many contexts, yet working dogs, especially hunting dogs and guard dogs, remained essential. This created a fascinating duality. Seleucus, one of the oldest dog breeds, were treasured by Bedouin peoples because they were classified differently from other dogs. They could sleep in tents, were treated with great affection. The distinction wasn't scientific. It was cultural accommodation of the reality that humans need dogs, even when religious law says they're unclean. The solution was to recognize that some dogs transcended the category of dog and became something else: companions, family members. This pattern repeated everywhere. No matter what the official cultural or religious stance on dogs was, humans found ways to keep them close, to maintain that ancient bond. Australian Aboriginal peoples had dingoes, which are technically wild dogs that had referral after domestication thousands of years earlier. Yet many Aboriginal groups kept dingoes as companions and guards. The animals existed in a liminal space between wild and domestic, but the relationship was unmistakable. It was the same relationship humans have always had with dogs. By the time European colonial expansion connected all these diverse cultures, dogs had been shaped into hundreds of distinct breeds, from the tiny Chihuahua to the massive Irish Wolfhound, from the swimming Portuguese water dog to the burrowing Dachshund, from the herding Border Collie to the truffle-hunting Lagotto Romagnolo. Each breed was a testament to how a particular culture had shaped dogs to meet specific needs. But here's what all these breeds shared. They all retained the fundamental canine capacity for bonding with humans. Every breed, no matter how specialized, still showed the behaviors that mark them as descendants of those first wolves who chose to live alongside humans. The pack bonding instinct, the ability to read human facial expressions and body language, the desire for human approval and affection, the capacity to learn from humans and work cooperatively with them. This wasn't because different cultures independently trained these traits into their dogs. It was because these traits were the foundation of dogness itself. Remove them, and you no longer have a dog. You have a wolf again, or something else entirely. The global diversity of dog cultures was really just infinite variations on a single theme. Two species are once predatory competitors, now so intertwined that neither could imagine existence without the other. Every culture that kept dogs discovered this truth independently. The bond wasn't just useful, it was profound. It reached something deep in human psychology and dog psychology both. And that bond still holds today, across every human culture on Earth. We've shaped dogs into forms ancient peoples would barely recognize. But the fundamental relationship, that ancient covenant between human and canine, remains exactly what it was 30,000 years ago. A mutual dependence that became mutual love. A working relationship that transcended utility and became family. So here we are, 40,000 years after those first wolves chose to walk alongside humans by firelight, sitting in a world where 900 million dogs share our homes, our lives, our very existence. But what does all this history actually mean? What can we learn from this extraordinary journey of mutual evolution? Let's start with the obvious question. If domestication could transform wolves into dogs, what does that tell us about evolution itself? For most of human history, we thought evolution was something that happened to species, not something species participated in. Natural selection was an external force, a cosmic judge deciding who lived and died based on random genetic variations. But the wolf-to-dog story reveals something far more interesting. Evolution isn't just about survival of the fittest. It's about survival of the most adaptable, the most willing to take risks, the most capable of recognizing opportunities. Those first wolves that approached human settlements weren't the strongest or the fastest. They were the curious ones, the brave ones, the ones willing to gamble that the strange two-legged creatures by the fire might be allies rather than threats. In evolutionary terms, they made a bet, and that bet paid off so spectacularly that their descendants now outnumber wild wolves by thousands to one. This tells us that evolution responds to behavior as much as environment. The wolves didn't wait for natural selection to slowly adapt them to human presence over millions of years. They changed their own behavior first, and the genetic changes followed. Biologists call this niche construction. When organisms modify their own environments or choose new ecological niches, they create new selection pressures that drive their own evolution. Humans did the same thing. We didn't just passively survive the genetic bottleneck. We actively shaped our evolution through our choices, our technologies, our social structures. We chose to cooperate, to share knowledge, to form alliances. Those choices created selection pressures that made us smarter, more social, better communicators. The wolf-to-dog journey is evolution as partnership, not combat, and that changes everything about how we understand our own origins. But there's a practical implication here that we can't ignore. If wolves could become dogs through this process, what happened to the wolves that didn't make that choice? Today, wild wolves are endangered across most of their historical range. In Europe, they were hunted nearly to extinction. In North America, systematic eradication campaigns reduced populations by over 90%. In Asia, habitat loss and human conflict continue to push wolf populations toward the brink. Here's the painful irony. The very same species that gave us dogs, our most beloved companions, now struggles to survive in a human-dominated world. We successfully partnered with one population of wolves 40,000 years ago, but we've spent the last few centuries trying to eliminate their wild relatives. Modern wolf conservation efforts are finally starting to reverse this trend. Wolves have been reintroduced to Yellowstone, where they've transformed entire ecosystems by controlling deer populations and allowing vegetation to recover. European wolf populations are slowly expanding as conservation laws protect them. But it's a fragile recovery, constantly threatened by human fear and economic interests. Understanding the deep history of wolf domestication should change how we think about conservation. These aren't just another endangered species. They're our evolutionary partners, the species that helped shape human civilization. Every dog that greets you at the door, every puppy that learns to trust humans, every service animal that guides the blind or comforts the traumatized. They're all living proof of what wolves made possible. Conservation isn't just about preserving biodiversity. It's about honoring the partnership that made us who we are. The wolves that chose to stay wild deserve to survive just as much as their domesticated cousins deserve our love. But let's flip the question around. What can dogs tell us about our own human evolution? Quite a lot, actually. The genetic and neurological changes that occurred during dog domestication mirror changes that happened in human evolution. We domesticated ourselves in many of the same ways wolves domesticated themselves. Remember those selection pressures that created friendly wolves, reduced aggression, increased social tolerance, juvenile features persisting into adulthood? Humans show exactly the same pattern. Compared to our ancestors from 100,000 years ago, modern humans have smaller, more gracile skeletons, reduced brow ridges, faces that retain childlike proportions into adulthood. Anthropologists call this self-domestication. Just like wolves, humans evolved to be less aggressive and more cooperative. The same genetic pathways that control domestication in dogs, especially genes related to neural crest cells, show signs of selection in human evolution too. We even show the domestication syndrome, not as dramatically as dogs, but the pattern is there. Reduced territorial aggression, increased capacity for cooperation with strangers, enhanced ability to read social cues. These traits made us successful in exactly the same way they made dogs successful. By allowing us to form larger, more complex social groups, dogs are like a mirror, showing us our own evolutionary path. They went through accelerated domestication in 40,000 years. We went through a similar process over hundreds of thousands of years, but the underlying mechanisms, the genetic changes, the behavioral transformations, they're remarkably similar. This means that every time you look at your dog, you're seeing a reflection of your own species' journey. The capacity for trust, the ability to form bonds across species lines, the willingness to cooperate rather than compete. These aren't just dog traits or human traits, they're partnership traits, evolved by both species to make our alliance possible. And that evolution is still happening, right now, in real time. Modern dogs are evolving faster than almost any other mammal. In just the past 200 years, humans have created over 450 distinct dog breeds, each with unique physical and behavioral traits. Breed creation is artificial selection on steroids, accelerating evolutionary changes that would normally take millions of years. But even beyond selective breeding, dogs are adapting to modern life in surprising ways. Urban dogs are learning to navigate subway systems, cross streets at traffic lights, even understand human pointing gestures that wolves can't interpret. These behavioral changes are happening within single generations, driven by learning rather than genetic changes. But learning can become genetic over time. If certain behaviors consistently improve survival and reproduction, natural selection will favor genetic variants that make those behaviors easier to learn. This is called genetic assimilation, and it's probably happening in dog populations right now. There's also evidence that dogs are developing enhanced abilities to process human social cues. Modern dogs are better at reading human facial expressions than dogs from just a few decades ago. This might be selection pressure from the pet industry. Dogs that bond more easily with humans are more likely to be kept and bred. The evolution never stops. Dogs are still adapting to us, and we're still adapting to them. But here's where things get really interesting. What about dogs that escape domestication? Feral dogs, populations living without direct human control, exist on every inhabited continent. In many developing countries, free-ranging dogs outnumber pets. These populations provide a natural experiment. What happens when domesticated animals return to the wild? The answer is surprising. They don't become wolves again. Feral dogs remain behaviorally distinct from wolves. They're less territorial, more flexible in their social structures, better at exploiting human-modified environments. But they also don't behave like typical pet dogs. They're warier of humans, more independent, better at finding food without human help. Feral dogs occupy a middle ground, still shaped by thousands of years of domestication, but readapting to life without direct human management. They show us that domestication isn't a one-way street. Evolution is always responding to current conditions, not past history. Some researchers think feral dogs might actually represent a more stable, long-term state than either wolves or pets. They can exploit human environments without depending completely on human care. In a changing world, that flexibility might be the ultimate survival strategy. This matters because it tells us something profound about domestication. It's not about creating dependence. It's about creating partnership. And partnerships can take many forms, from the intimate bond of a pet dog to the loose association of village dogs that scavenge human waste but maintain their independence. All of these are valid outcomes of the original wolf-human alliance, different expressions of the same evolutionary partnership. But let's talk about that bond, that deep neurological connection between modern humans and dogs. When you lock eyes with your dog, something extraordinary happens in both your brains. Oxytocin levels increase, the same hormone released during breastfeeding, romantic bonding, and parent-child attachment. This creates a positive feedback loop. Looking at your dog releases oxytocin, which makes you want to look at your dog more, which releases more oxytocin. Dogs are the only non-primate species that can trigger this response in humans. Not even wolves can do it. This is a co-evolved trait, built into both species through 40,000 years of partnership. We're neurologically wired to bond with dogs, and they're neurologically wired to bond with us. Brain imaging studies show that when people look at their dogs, the same regions light up that activate when they look at their own children. Dogs activate our parental care systems, our nurturing instincts. And when dogs look at their humans, their brains show activity patterns associated with positive anticipation and reward. This isn't trained behavior. It's deeper than training. It's evolutionary adaptation at the neurological level. Our brains and dog brains have become complementary, designed to understand and respond to each other. Some researchers think this bond is actually older than 40,000 years. They argue that the neurological capacity for cross-species bonding might have evolved during the genetic bottleneck when human survival depended on forming alliances and cooperating with anyone, even across species lines. If that's true, then dogs didn't just benefit from our capacity for cooperation, they helped create it. The selection pressures that made us capable of bonding with dogs might be the same pressures that made us capable of building civilizations. We evolved together in the deepest sense possible, not just sharing environments, but reshaping each other's brains. So what does all this mean for our future together? We're at an interesting moment in the human-dog relationship. For the first time in 40,000 years, many dogs live lives completely separated from the survival functions they originally served. They don't guard our settlements or help us hunt. They're companions, emotional support, family members. Some people worry this represents the end of the working partnership that created dogs. But maybe it's just the next phase of evolution. Maybe the bond itself is the function now. Maybe emotional support and companionship are just as evolutionarily important as hunting and guarding. Mental health research certainly suggests this. Dog ownership correlates with reduced depression, lower anxiety, faster recovery from illness. Service dogs help veterans with PTSD, guide blind people, detect seizures before they happen. These aren't trivial benefits. They're life-saving, health-promoting, evolutionarily significant advantages. The partnership continues. It just looks different than it did 40,000 years ago. And that's the real lesson from the wolf-to-dog story. Evolution isn't about perfection or final forms. It's about adaptation, flexibility, the willingness to change when conditions change. Wolves became dogs by being flexible, by taking risks, by trying something new. We became human the same way, by cooperating when competition seemed safer, by sharing when hoarding seemed smarter, by trusting when suspicion seemed more rational. The bond between humans and dogs isn't just history. It's a living reminder that evolution rewards partnership over competition, cooperation over conquest. Two species that chose to walk together, that changed each other at the deepest genetic levels, that built a relationship so strong it spans 40,000 years and shows no signs of ending. Every dog that falls asleep beside a human tonight is proof that the greatest evolutionary strategy isn't survival of the fittest. It's survival of the most connected, the most cooperative, the most willing to build bridges across the boundaries that separate us. We didn't conquer wolves. We didn't domesticate them in the traditional sense. We partnered with them, and that partnership changed everything. So here we are, after tens of thousands of years, two species that should have been competitors became something else entirely, something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. Partners. Think about what we've traced tonight. Wolves that approached human fires not because they were weak or desperate, but because they were smart enough to see opportunity where others saw only danger. Humans who looked at these predators and didn't just see threats or competitors, but potential allies, both species making a choice that would transform them forever. This wasn't domestication in the traditional sense. not humans deliberately breeding wolves into dogs through some conscious plan. Nobody sat down 40,000 years ago and said, "Let's create golden retrievers." Instead, this was something far more profound: mutual evolution. Two species shaping each other through thousands of generations of coexistence, cooperation, and genuine partnership. The wolves who stayed by our fires became dogs, but we became something different too. We became a species that could hunt more effectively, travel farther, settle in more challenging environments. We became safer, more successful, more capable. The archaeological record shows this clearly. Sites with evidence of early dogs also show evidence of more successful human communities, more permanent settlements, better hunting success, greater population stability. Both species paid a price. Wolves gave up some of their independence, their purely wild nature. They became smaller, less aggressive, more dependent on human society. We gave up some of our flexibility too. Once we had dogs, we couldn't easily abandon them. We had to consider their needs, their feeding, their care. We became responsible for another species. But what we gained was incalculable. Dogs gave us their senses, their loyalty, their tireless work. We gave them security, regular food, protection from larger predators. Together, we became more than either species could have been alone. Every dog alive today carries genes from those ancient wolves who first approached human fires. Every breed, from the smallest Chihuahua to the largest Great Dane, from herding collies to hunting hounds to companion lapdogs, they all trace their ancestry back to that first meeting. Those first tentative moments when a wolf and a human looked at each other and saw not enemy, but possibility. And the remarkable thing, the bond hasn't weakened. If anything, it's grown stronger. Genetic studies show that dogs can read human facial expressions better than any other species, including our closest primate relatives. They've evolved the ability to understand pointing gestures, to follow our gaze, to sense our emotions. Their brains respond to human voices in ways that wolves' brains never will. We've changed for them too. Humans across cultures smile more at dogs than at almost anything else. Our voices automatically shift to higher, gentler tones when we speak to them. Our stress hormones decrease, our oxytocin levels increase, just from petting a dog. These aren't learned behaviors, they're adaptations written into our biology through millennia of coevolution. So when you look at your dog tomorrow, remember what you're seeing. Not just a pet, not just a companion, but the product of one of the most remarkable partnerships in evolutionary history, a species that chose us as surely as we chose them, a living connection to our ancient ancestors who survived ice ages and migrations with wolves by their side. Two species, one story. A story of cooperation and mutual transformation, of wolves who became dogs and humans who became different because they were together, of a bond forged in the ancient past that still shapes both species today. Before we drift off to sleep tonight, I'd like to ask a small favour. If you've enjoyed this journey through the deep history of our oldest friendship, please consider leaving a like on this video. It helps more people discover these stories, and I'd genuinely love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop a comment telling me your location and maybe something about your own dog, or a dog you've known. There's something beautiful about knowing we're all scattered across the world, connected by these stories and by our shared bond with these ancient companions. If you'd like to support the creation of more content like this, there's an optional YouTube membership available. No pressure whatsoever, but it does help make these deep dives possible. And of course, subscribing means you'll never miss the next story. Now let the last thoughts settle gently. Imagine those first wolves around those first fires, shadows in the darkness gradually moving closer. Imagine the generations that followed, slowly changing, adapting, becoming something new together. Imagine the countless humans and dogs through thousands of years, hunting together, travelling together, sleeping by the same fires, and know that this ancient bond continues tonight. In homes across the world, dogs are curling up beside their humans, just as their ancestors curled up beside ours all those millennia ago. Some things don't change. Some partnerships run deeper than time itself. Sleep well, and maybe, just maybe, dream of wolves and fires and the beginning of the oldest friendship in human history.